So, I'm Jonas Staal. I'm a founder of an artistic and political organization which is called the New World Summit, with whom we are developing this parliament that was just referenced. And I'm going to try in a short time to introduce, let's say, the general idea of this organization. It's founded in 2012. It consists of about 15 different members from the field of art, design, architecture, philosophy, diplomacy. And we develop what we call alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. So the image that you see here is basically an example of such a parliament. This was the first one we ever created in Berlin in 2012. So it's this kind of temporary architectural construction that, well, I mean, takes the form of a parliament, but also tries to interrogate what is a parliament, how do we represent politics, how do we perform politics. And the flags that you see all around this construction belong to organizations that are today blacklisted. So blacklisted means that you are placed on so-called designated lists of terrorist organizations. And today, or at least in the process in which the war on terror developed, being placed on a blacklist means that you lose your passport, you cannot travel, your bank accounts are frozen. So you are considered a threat to democracy to the point where you have to literally be declared stateless, because that is essentially what happens when you lose your passports, and you cannot organize yourself politically. You're placed outside of the political order. And we asked ourselves the questions as artists, as designers, as architects, what exactly are the voices and politics represented by this blacklist? And what does it mean when we say the blacklist, the so-called terrorist, is the limit to what democracy can bear or what democracy can represent? And is this rhetoric, this general rhetoric that the so-called terrorists are, those who are terrorists are so because they hate democracy or oppose our democracy, is this really true? So we attempted to organize this parliament and invited all organizations, as far as we were capable of being in contact with them and finding tricky ways to get them into this parliament, to discuss the meaning of this blacklist, to discuss the history of their political organization, their objective. So it was a kind of counter-parliament, the parliament that represents those that are at this moment systemically excluded from existing political order. Here you see from the left to the right representatives of the Basque independence movement, the Kurdish women's movement, then across the Filipino revolutionary movement and the Azawadian independence movement in northern Mali. Unfortunately, I'm not do not have the time now to go into the details of each of these, but what was interesting is that those organizations that responded to our invitation are organizations that have a very long history in anti-colonial liberational struggle, social movements, Pan-African movements, etc., meaning that these are also organizations of which many have a very profound and specific idea of what democracy is or should be. And that's actually where it becomes interesting, in the sense that what we quickly found out through the discourse and exchanges with many of these organizations is that the main reason why they are a threat to democracy is because they are too democratic for what we call democracy, in terms of capitalist democracy and its imperialist war on terror, because that is essentially what it is. And the use of the blacklist concerns organizations that in many cases there are a million reasons why you would prosecute them legally, through legal means. There's never a reason to place them outside of the very order of politics and the law, because this is what opens up the space for what we should refer to as state terror, and that is of course the biggest danger today. The main threat that we are facing are not small non-state so-called terrorist organizations. The main threat that we are facing is state terrorism. The war on terror is a form of state terrorism in our perspective. So we continue to develop these parliaments since 2012. We developed them in Berlin, we developed them in Leiden in the Netherlands, Kochi in India, in Brussels. That's the image that you see here. We broadened also the specter of organizations we work with, not only organizations that are prosecuted as blacklisted groups, but also stateless political organizations, stateless for different reasons, like for example, Somaliland or Scotland are stateless semi-autonomous regions not recognized as states, so their right to self-determination is not acknowledged, but they're not necessarily prosecuted as so-called terrorist organizations, so there are other mechanisms of exclusion. The current so-called refugee crisis, the hundreds of thousands of people that are currently stateless within Europe are not necessarily considered terrorists, even though they're often being accused of being so. But they are stateless nonetheless, or excluded from political representation, the right to education, the right to healthcare, etc. And then there's a big problem that's often not being discussed. That is the stateless nation that is being born in Europe right now. So it is the people, the children that are being born in refugee camps, in limbo, that have no form of administrative state representation whatsoever. Here are some examples of the by now more than 40 different political organizations that we have worked with, stateless political groups we worked with. These are maps we developed together with each of them, because which was an interesting endeavor, because it also shows the different vision of autonomy and independence that many of them struggle for. So not every stateless political organization wants a nation state. Sometimes it is, like let's say in traditional separatist organizations, like the Basque Country wants to be an independent state, wants to separate from Spain, rightfully so, in my opinion, but okay. But there's many examples also of regions that are fighting to become autonomous zones or autonomous structures of a different kind. So we try to also develop in exchange with them a language that could visualize and introduce different visions of autonomy than the ones that we are currently familiar with. In this case, they were placed in a parliament in the Royal Flemish Theatre, where there were these maps were kind of placed all around the parliament, this arena-shaped parliament. And day by day, speakers over 3 days introduced, let's say, unfolded an alternative reading of the world map, because in some way that's actually what we're trying to do. It is an attempt to narrate and engage and visualize the history of the world, but from the perspective of the stateless, of those who live without a state, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes forced. So here you see a debate between Musa Assarit of the National Liberation Movement of Azawad. He's a long-time contributor. He was also in the first image. And there's Shugut Gileta of the Oromo Liberation Front in what we currently consider as Ethiopia. Now, this work that we've been doing the past 4 years introduced us to many different visions of autonomy, many different visions of independence. We had the chance to be invited by several of the movements that we worked with, that we invited in the parliament, that on their turn invited us in their regions. And probably one of the most important ones for the development of our work as a New World Summit is the Kurdish revolutionary movement, Kurdish women's movement in particular. This is Dilar Dirik speaking. Behind the map that immediately says something about why this movement is so particularly relevant. Different than what you might have remembered from this overview of maps of the previous slide. In that slide you saw, I guess, many regions which have relatively clear territorial boundaries. Like we understand the state in terms of a specific demarcation of space. In the case of the Kurdish women's movement in particular, Dilar proposed this map, which does demarcate the outlines of the Kurdish region, which is today separated between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. But on top of it, something else emerges. It is a kind of ideological map that she refers to as democratic confederalism, and which introduces a philosophy that is quite a unique one, developed by Abdullah Öcalan, was already mentioned, founder of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The PKK, considered a so-called terrorist organization by Turkey because it's from 1978 on fought a guerrilla war against the Turkish state to establish its own independent Kurdish state. But then, specifically due to the influence of the women's movement within the PKK, over a course of decades of guerrilla struggle, that goal slowly changed. Women were also partly co-founders of the PKK. Sakina Jansis, murdered in 2013 in Paris, is an example of that. And they started to critique the very structure of the state as a patriarchal representation of a very, let's say, male perspective of power and independence. It is about territory, it's about demarcation, it's about centralized structures of power. And they proposed a feminist reading of a future project of autonomy, which became known as democratic confederalism or stateless democracy. I know this is like a way too long and complicated story to kind of summarize very shortly, but I'm going to try to do my best. In the process of here the historical map of Kurdistan, in the process in which the Syrian civil war started in 2011, the Kurds, which are marked here, the Kurdish territories of Syria, had a chance to separate from the existing Assad regime. Assad was forced to fight the Free Syrian Army in the south. It left a power vacuum in the north, the northern part being the historical Kurdish part of Syria, and Kurdish revolutionaries, together with allies, Syrians, Arabs, took over their original land. And that's where they declared this model of stateless democracy, which is a very curious concept. It's basically based on the idea of autonomy as a non-state model, so a rejection of the nation state, a rejection of centralized structures of power, with a focus on local self-governance of communes. So let's say the communes is the wijkraad, let's say the smallest political entity of society. Basic principles that surround that are gender equality. So every political organization in the region is represented by a man and a woman. There's quota for women participation, so at least there has to be at least 40% of women participating in political life. And communal economy. So a lot of the economy, this is also a relatively rural area, so a lot of the economy historically was also agricultural in nature. So cooperatives are a really crucial part of it. This whole very curious and progressive set of values that seems very new, but it developed over decades of struggle, first in the Turkish part of Kurdistan, North Kurdistan, then moved to Syria, is being practiced in the region that you see here in yellow. Red is the Assad-occupied territories. Black are Islamic State-occupied territories. So it's developing in a very, very particular, conflictuous, isolated region. I had the chance to visit the region 3 times by invitation of what is known as the Democratic Self-Administration, so basically the autonomous government of this Kurdish area, to witness the development of new public parliaments. So these are the parliaments in which communes are governing themselves. For me, it was quite important that actually it was an old theater that was being used as a parliament. I mean, for me, that says something about what the theater allows for as a kind of social space, as a performative space. And for me, the space of politics and the idea of the parliament obviously is a very theatrical space. And that's also what it is, historically speaking. Important part of the movements are women militia. So there's many different autonomous women's organizations. In the women's militia, those that defend the territory against threats of Islamic State, Assad, Turkey, there is this idea of radical democracy is pushed through. So fighters elect their own commanders. So the idea is that this notion of self-governance goes even to self-organized defense forces. It relates to education, it relates to politics, it relates to economy. So from the smallest level to the biggest part of society. Here, for example, in the Women's Academy, a new kind of academy that tries to study the history of women in relationship to stateless and colonized classes. So the revolutionary momentum also allows for new forms of science, new forms of art to emerge, I think. The project that we developed together with the autonomous government of Rojava was a commission we got to build a new parliament for the region. So when we visited the first time in 2014, tried to understand the history of the revolution, these new institutions that were being built politically, educationally, culturally, we of course also showed the work we did as the summit. That's why we were invited. And immediately the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amina, also suggested you should organize a summit here because we want to meet these organizations from your network, and we want to see if there can be exchanges between the Kurdish people and the Basque people and the Scottish people and God knows what. Maybe this could be a way of creating a new kind of alliance of stateless peoples. But then we want this not to be a parliament that is a temporary intervention in a theater or an art space. It has to be a new public parliament. It has to become part of a new symbolism of the revolution we're trying to wage. And the idea that came as a result was the idea of a public parliament. So the parliament as a public space, not as something that is secluded within a building that represents the idea of an elite governing the people, but a parliament as a public space, including a park that we're developing around it, based on this form of the agora, the historical Athens, space in Athens where political assemblies would take place, in which the distance between the people being represented and the people present in the parliament is minimized. So that's of course the idea, the revolutionary idea of self-governance. That those that you govern are also the people that are part of the very same space. So there's no distinction between the one that's being represented and the one that's being present. It relates that the parliament is covered by different flags from all the new local organizations that came into being as part of the revolution. And you see that from the base, from the agora, there's a series of pillars that emerge, which are essentially the, let's say, the main ideological propositions that came as a result of the revolution. So self-governance, confederalism, gender equality, social ecology, the right to self-defense. And the project, the start of the building of the project began in August 2015. It's been quite complex, logistically speaking. We should not presume that in a war zone or conflict zone there is no form of economy, or no one drives cars, or there's no one taking a bus. Of course, informally there are still forms of economic exchange, even between enemy lines. Like there is even pragmatic economic exchange between Islamic State territories and Kurdish territories. Wars, that sense, a very complex situation. Here you see basically step by step the parliament grow. And what I think is important about that process of building is that it literally tells the story that the parliament wants to tell. It starts at the base, it starts at the assembly. From there, the assembly of people trying to self-govern. From there, a series of principles emerge, which are the principles represented by these different pillars. Here, the celebration of the first start of construction. We brought an international delegation of politicians, other stateless peoples, artists, academics, to witness that moment or to celebrate that moment. Some of you are in the room, I saw. And from there, continued to construct. I have to put a bit of pace in this. The parliament to the phase where it is now. I think what is important about this project for us, or what I hope it contributes to this discussion on the relationship between art and conflict, is that conflict is also, or can be, a creative force. And I don't mean that in the sense to relativate what is happening in this region. I was there now just for 3 months. I saw many martyrs coming home from frontline fighting Islamic State, people we got close to. It's shit. Like, let's not idealize this place as something like, oh, it's amazing, utopia, paradise. Lately, newspapers have been tending to kind of to very, very much romanticize what's going on there. But it is a fact that the crisis of the Syrian war and all of its disastrous effects and the disastrous response of the international community, truly disastrous, including the Netherlands, that is now going to top bombing this place on top of God knows who's already flying over it. Nonetheless, these crises are also moments in which very foundational forms of self-reflection can take place. In this case, what does it mean when the state is crumbling? An old colonial state is crumbling. I think from within the Kurdish movement and its allies, there is an imaginary that comes as a result of this conflict that tries to translate the hell on earth that is currently Syria in many ways into something that could be a durable response for the future of this place. So there's a creative force, and this creative force has everything to do with art as well. There's a political imaginary, and for me and for my colleagues, the question is, what is the place of art when it situates itself within this imaginary? Can this imaginary of a new world that is fought for by a revolutionary movement, can it also create a new imaginary of art? And I hope that this parliament is a modest contribution to that quest or to that endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jonas Staal.